Hi. Years ago, I ran across this book by Che Guevara. It's called Guerrilla Warfare. And one of the interesting things to me was in the first chapter, it contains a packing list of what Che Guevara recommended a guerrilla fighter carry, the equipment that he would need to go into a situation where he was waging a guerrilla war for freedom. And I started thinking about it, and I was like, well, it would be really interesting to try to put together the equipment that a Che Guevara, one of his guerrillas, would have. And the scenario that Che set out in this book was that the guerrilla would have to be able to survive by himself if separated from the main guerrilla band. So there was a certain amount of survival gear in there. So I thought I would try to put together, try to stay as truthful to Che's list as possible and try to put together that list. So the first thing he said that a guerrilla needs is a rifle, and he specified that one of the rifles that he specified was the Belgian FAL. Now mine's a Sturmgewehr 58, which is a Belgian FAL that would have been manufactured in Switzerland around 1958, which was Che's heyday. That's when he was fighting in Cuba, and then in the 1960s he fought in Bolivia, and I think he fought in the Congo in between those two incidents. Mine's not exactly true to form. Probably looks more true to form this way, but this rifle's got a Picatinny rail on it for a light and a optic on top, so that would be more modern. That wouldn't be necessarily faithful to what Che would have carried, but Che would have had a jungle type carbine, which this is, with a 16-inch barrel and open sights. Not necessarily for long range, but great for the jungle and mountains that Che would have been fighting in.
Correction, I was having a senior moment when I kept saying that this rifle was made in Switzerland. The true story is it's an Austrian rifle, but it was actually made in the United States since it became illegal to import foreign-made assault rifles into the United States. DSA imported the entire Austrian factory and manufactures them in the United States. Just a quick footnote for you firearms enthusiasts who would have obviously known that this rifle was not made in Switzerland.
One of the things that Che says that a guerrilla needs is a knapsack. So what I have here is a nylon modern day knapsack, but I think it's fairly similar to the type of canvas knapsack that one of Che's guerrillas would have carried. One of the first things on Che's packing list is a book. So the book I chose is Guerrilla Warfare by Che Guevara. He said that the book should, there's times when guerrilla warfare is very boring and just be sitting around waiting for something to happen. In the case of our scenario where the guerrilla has been separated from the main group, he might just have to wait somewhere in the woods, and he needs something to entertain him and educate him as well. So Che would have had a book for his guerrillas that would have both political and military education value for them. One of the things that Che talked about was just simply having a tobacco to smoke. So for Che's tobacco, I brought some 2 for 99-cent Swisher Sweets. That's the guerrillas wouldn't be smoking $200 cigars out there. Now Che himself was a doctor, and he talked about medical kit, but I guess his list did talk about surgical instruments, which I don't have because I'm not a surgeon, but he also talked about just having some basic things, medical supplies that an individual guerrilla would have had. So here's a penicillin, an anti-diarrheal, an antacid, some band-aids, and some aspirin. So that would have been the guerrilla first aid kit that one of Che's original guerrillas would have had. Now what I'm wearing is what Che recommended. He simply said a work shirt. So this is the type of shirt. It's a Dickies brand work shirt, like the janitor at your high school would have worn. And then he also talked about the importance of having sturdy shoes or boots. So I just simply have some U.S. Army type combat boots. Now, in order to clean the rifle, you need a rifle cleaning kit. So I have one of those here. And then inside this kit would be a cleaning rod, patches, a cloth, cleaning oil, I chose Break Free, which is cleans, lubricates, and protects the weapon. Che talked about the importance of keeping things dry. I'm obviously in a Che Guevara type environment here where it's very hot and humid. It's like 90 degrees here. So Che talked about having the importance of having a plastic or nylon cloth to cover your gear so it doesn't get wet. So the thing that I brought along is simply, I went to a Dollar Tree, and for $1 you can get a plastic picnic tablecloth, and very handy in the field. It's green. I want to attract attention to your guerrilla band hiding in the woods. Che talks about having a cloth to clean the rifle, so I substituted a bandana, and of course anybody that's outdoorsy at all knows that a bandana can be used to purify water or pot holder. I mean, a bandana's just got an infinite number of uses. Che talked about having a line or cord, so I used a parachute cord, which would have definitely existed in Che's time. They had paratroopers back in World War II. Che talked about having a sewing kit, basically, to repair the uniform. In Bolivia, Che and his guerrillas just went to the field for months at a time, and they truly survived off the land. They hunted everything that they ate. So having a sewing kit was necessary because their clothing would have become ripped and torn without any resupply. Che talked about the importance of machete, and so the machete that I chose was made by Imacasa in El Salvador, and Imacasa also has the name, another name, Condor. So their high-end machetes and other things are called Condor, and they're very expensive. I bought this at a hardware store in Central America, and it's very inexpensive. I've used it for yard work. You can tell how rusty it is, and that's how you know, a Latin American guerrilla's machete would have looked, because you know, it's a tool to them. It's not like it's a showroom piece that they're going to keep polished. It's no big deal if it's rusty. I sharpened it. It's very, very sharp. Che talked about how when you're fighting in the mountains, even in tropical countries, South American countries like Bolivia or Cuba, it's good to have a jacket. And I would have liked to have had a Gore-Tex jacket, but Gore-Tex didn't exist back then, so I simply have an olive drab nylon jacket. Would have been somewhat water resistant. It would have been warm in those cold nights. Che talked a lot about food, and I think the guerrillas were often just starving out in the woods. They didn't have, they weren't like soldiers. I was in the U.S. Army, and you know, we always had plenty of food, plenty of MREs, hot meals served, because we had you know, all this logistics, and we had air and naval superiority that could bring lots of supplies into us. But when you're a guerrilla, you don't have that. You just have to literally live off the land, and much of Che's time would have been spent just trying to get food. So let's talk about some of the food that Che recommended. I've got right here, I've got olive oil, and you can just find some weeds or something in the garden and cook it on a campfire, and then put olive oil in it, which is very calorie dense and would make a very filling meal for a guerrilla. Che talked about having a spoon and a fork and a knife. Talked about having a camping type mess kit, but I just used a spoon from a meal ready to eat and a plastic fork. I have some, he talked about sweets, so I have a bunch of candy here that I got at a Latin American grocery store nearby. Che talked about having preserved fish, but I've never really liked fish, so I'm gonna deviate from Che's packing list just a little bit, and this is preserved chicken jerky. All types of little odds and ends that Che recommended. We have in here a bar of soap. It would have been, Che talked about the need for sanitation, so if you've got your fork and your plate and your spoon and you leave food on them, it's going to cause you to get dysentery. And if you read Che's Bolivian diary, they did suffer immensely from dysentery. So field sanitation is was important. We also got, Che talked about seasoning, because like I said, they're making, just picking weeds and cooking them up in a pot with some olive oil. I needed some seasoning, so I've got some Mexican classic seasoning, some sugar, just little odds and ends just to make the meal taste better. She talked about the need of had to have dental hygiene, so I have a toothbrush and toothpaste. Talked about canned food, so I have some good old beefaroni. Che talked about just some personal food, so I chose these red hot sausages, which would have been fairly popular, kind of like chorizo. And then Che talked about leche azucarada condensada, or sweetened condensed milk. And I've been a lot of different places in the world, and I got this in the Czech Republic, and this is simply a toothpaste tube full of sweetened condensed milk. Very high calorie, high energy food to eat in a hurry when you're a guerrilla. So Che talked about having a knife, and I think what he meant was having a knife like a, butter knife to, eat your food. But I used a Barlow knife, which is a very old and respected brand of knife, and this could have been used for eating, but also for general utility. Che talked about the importance of a hammock, and I'm going to make a part 2 to this video that talks about, basically we're going to go camping with Che's gear and see how it works out. This is a war bonnet hammock, and it's also got an insect net integrated with it. Che just talked about how the hammock was just so important for mountainous warfare, which is what he always was fighting. He fought in the Sierra Maestra mountains of Cuba, and then he finally was killed in the mountains of Bolivia. And so in both those environments, it's very difficult to find a flat place to pitch a tent or even to sleep. So the guerrillas would have all had hammocks. And Che talked about how each guerrilla's hammock had a characteristic smell because it was just so, the body odor would just seep into the hammock. Che talked about the need of a blanket, and so what I have here is a Snug Pack jungle blanket. It's kind of similar to a poncho liner, nylon insulation, very lightweight, compact. And Che talked about again having a nylon cloth, so this would have been used to make a roof over top of the hammock, and we'll set that up in part 2 of this video. Che talked about having his mess kit. So Che said a military type mess kit would be perfectly adequate, and this is very ironic. I enlisted in the North Carolina National Guard in 1986, and I was given this mess kit. It looks like it's never been used, right? And that's because it never has been used. When I went to the field with the Army, they would always serve hot meals on paper plates, and that was for sanitation reasons. Soldiers will fail to clean their mess kit properly, and then they end up not being able to properly clean it, and they get dysentery. So the Army figured out it's just best to use chinettes or whatever to serve soldiers. So I spent 29 years and 10 months in uniform, and I had this mess kit from beginning to end and never used it, so I thought it was kind of funny. Che talked about water bottles, so just a regular Nalgene bottle, and because of the fact that it's extremely hot weather and it might be difficult to find water sources, I've also got a British Army 1-quart canteen, or maybe it's 1 liter, close enough. Che talked about the need for a compass, especially in the early stages of a guerrilla war. But then Che said, once they start operating in an area for a certain period of time, the compass wasn't really as handy as it used to be. But this is a United States Army issue lensatic compass, and it contains radioactive tritium markings, so in pitch black dark, if you're navigating through the woods, then that's what you'd end up shooting your azimuth with, and you can, without having to show a flashlight and give away your position, you can just follow the azimuth on your compass. Used it quite a bit when I was in the infantry officer basic course at Fort Benning, Georgia, and it works very well. So, I guess the final thing I can find is, Che talked about ammunition, and I want to take the opportunity while we're talking about ammunition to talk about the rifles that he recommended. So I've got on my pack, it's got a hip belt, and on the hip belt I've got it's actually a Russian ammunition pouch that fits the FNFAL magazine. This is a metric magazine, so the FNFAL, British ones had different specifications from all the other ones, and the one I have was made in Switzerland, so it uses the metric magazines. They hold 20 rounds, and it's 308 Winchester or 7.62 NATO. Now, it was kind of interesting to me because when you see pictures of Che Guevara-like revolutionaries, they always have an AK-47. That seems like that's the iconic communist revolutionary weapon. But if you read the book Guerrilla Warfare by Che, in the first chapter he talks about weapons, and I guess the Soviets just hadn't provided those type of weapons to the Western Hemisphere at the time that Che was active, because he doesn't mention any of the Russian weapons. He talks about what they had in Cuba was basically World War II hand-me-downs that Batista had probably gotten from the United States. So he was fighting against soldiers armed with M1 Garands, a lot of bolt-action rifles. In Bolivia, both the guerrillas and the Bolivian army had bolt-action Mauser rifles. And then they would have just had, he talked about capturing some Uzis one time, which I found to be interesting. But in guerrilla warfare, he talks about the rifles that would be suitable. And he mentions the M1 Garand, he mentions the M14, and he mentions the FNFAL. And he seems to have the FNFAL and the M14 as in a different category from other rifles. It seems like he was thinking of employing them sort of like a Browning automatic rifle, where it would have been to lay down a lot of firepower, which is not how Western armies use those weapons. The weapons in that caliber are called battle rifles, 308 or 30-06 in the case of the M1 Garand. They're full power cartridges. So that's what Che liked, and that's what Che would have had. And so when we do our part 2 of this video, we're gonna carry the FNFAL, because it's the only thing I had on Che's list. I don't have an M1 Garand or an M14, so we're gonna have to go with the FNFAL. So with that, I will end this video, and I look forward to about 3 weeks from now. I'm going to take all this gear and go out to the mountains of West Virginia in August, which is going to be the closest I can come to the Sierra Maestra Mountains in Cuba, or the mountains of the Andes in Bolivia. And so we'll just have to ask ourselves, what would Che do? So hasta la victoria siempre, and I'll see you in about a month.